Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for being here from different parts of the country and possibly as the session may unfold all over the world as well. I am Shubhangini Gupta. I am one of the graduate coordinators for the workshop series conducted by Stanford Global Studies called Neoliberal Heritagecapes. We have with us today the lovely Kesha Fong from Weizmann School of Design at University of Pennsylvania. Before I move into the introductions for our speaker and what we'll be talking about today, I thought I'll just take a minute to talk about the workshop series that we're doing and the event that's being hosted as a part of it. So Neoliberal Heritagecapes is a workshop series that aims at looking at heritage questions in the context of urban development, planning, especially in conflict and post-conflict landscapes around the world. So what we are interested specifically in looking at is how not just different heritage practices are instrumentalized and used in different ways by state actors, by non-state actors, by citizens, by communities to transform a material and social landscape, but also use this as a platform to bring in disciplinary conversations that talk about heritage in different ways. So we've so far had practitioners of heritage conservation, Kesha included, as well as people who deal with the more theoretical, anthropological, historical, and political facets of heritage to uncover how different stakeholders instrumentalize these conversations to their own benefit. So as a part of the same series, we have with us Kesha Fong today. She is a heritage conservation educator and a professional of the built environment who specializes in heritage conservation theory, history, and practice. She's been a practicing conservator for many years and has also been imparting that knowledge along with from more practical applied approach and a theoretical approach to her students at the Weizmann School of Design at University of Pennsylvania. Her current research, a facet of which she'll be sharing with us today, focuses on the technical and socio-political dimensions of conservation work in Asia and post-colonial societies, particularly as they intersect issues of civil society, governance, and development. She's a lecturer in the graduate program of historic preservation at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and the editor of Change Over Time, which is an international journal of conservation and the built environment. So thank you so much, Kesha, for being with us today and sharing a part of your research. I'll also quickly introduce a bit of myself because she will be in conversation with me. I am, like I mentioned, my name is Shubhangini. I am a third year PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University. My research also looks at heritage questions, specifically with notions of ownership and expertise that are produced vis-a-vis the built environment and built heritage. Using the case study of these residential mansions in a rural belt in Rajasthan in India. So with that, Kesha, I will hand over the mic to you to get our session for today rolling.
All right, my mic's on, yes? Okay, yes. Thank you so much, Shubi, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you for inviting me. I have to admit that I feel a bit humbled to be included among many of the very accomplished scholars you've hosted in this series thus far. So today I'm going to present doctoral research. So these are ideas that I'm still working through, and I really look forward to our conversation because I anticipate that I'll glean something, different ways, different insights into these ideas and how I might argue them. So first, a note on positionality. I approached this research with a practitioner's background, as Shubi mentioned. I worked in the field as a conservation practitioner and educator for nearly 20 years before interrogating conservation as a field of inquiry and socio-spatial practice. I was drawn to Yangon as a case worth investigating because what I observed there in the 2010s was unlike anything I had seen elsewhere in my work. I observed I perceived a potentially exceptional example of built heritage conservation practice and one that I thought might prove instructive for intentional conservation. Oh, I have slides. Hold on a second. Okay, can everyone see the slides? Excellent. All right, so I was drawn to Yangon as a case worth investigating because what I observed there in the 2010s is unlike anything I had seen elsewhere in my work. I perceived a potentially exceptional example of built heritage conservation practice, and one that I thought might prove instructive for international conservation discourse and the set of best practices that are wielded as a measure of excellence. I certainly saw it as unusual for Southeast Asian cities. My emphasis and angle into this work is through conservation, and I want to emphasize that it's through the method, not just through heritage. In this project, I'm looking at how conservation is understood, how it is practiced, how it comes together, and to what effect. Today, I present one aspect of this research, or I'm trying to present one aspect of this research as opposed to all of it, and that is how heritage conservation was leveraged to cultivate civic practices. So you may ask, how is this pertinent to a lecture series of post-conflict cities and neoliberal heritage scapes? I elaborate. Yangon, as the former capital, historical entrepot, and primate city of Myanmar. I'm going to, are you guys all in the way of my images?
No, we can see them.
You can see the totality of them? Okay, good.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Yangon as the former capital, historical entrepot, and primate city of Myanmar, with one of the holiest pilgrimage sites in the Buddhist world, is and has long been contentious political ground. Although intentionally decentered with the relocation of the capital to Naypyidaw in 2005, it remains the most visible theater of Burmese modernity, urbanism, and identity. I examine a small window of time in which these issues were briefly renegotiated through what I refer to as the nascent Yangon Heritage Movement. So it's this second decade of the 21st century. And for this crowd, I probably need not geospatially orient you all, but it seems proper protocol to do so. So the map on the left-hand side is of Myanmar. A note on terminology, Myanmar is the official name of the country, but within the country, I found people using both Burma and Myanmar, and that tended to be a generational issue. So older people often use the term Burma, and the younger people who grew up with the official term Myanmar use that term. I slipped between the two, and it is without intention. The two images on the right are of Yangon. You have an historic image of its religious features of the landscape, and the bottom right image where you can still see religious features within the contemporary urban scape. Oops, excuse me. All right, so here we have a synthetic chronology of significant political shifts of the country, and most of which were really staged in Yangon. So King Alongpaya founded Yangon in the 18th century as an international trading port. The country was later conquered and colonized through a series of wars by the British, and that's the sort of descent onto Yangon in the 19th century image. The country gained its independence in 1948. That handover occurred at the Secretariat, a building that is in the center of Yangon. In 1962, that elected parliamentary system was toppled through a military coup led by General Ne Win. The image there is of tanks coming down the streets of Yangon. And between 1962 and 2011, the military government really ruled the country as a semi-autarkic stratocracy. And it is that period that was known to the West as really a period of egregious human rights violations. During that period, the Burmese public engaged in a series of large-scale protests against the government, which frequently resulted in mass incarceration, censure, or death. So when President Thein Sein, seen there in the top left image at 2011, of the new nominally civilian government implemented a series of modified political reforms, everyone took notice, both within the country and from outside the country. The reforms unleashed a frenzy of activity across all sectors of society and opened the door to enhanced international engagement. Thus, we see him there at the United Nations. Economic liberalization by the state, coupled with for-profit interests in a new Asian market, resulted in rampant speculative investment. All of this was most evident in Yangon. The long-term intentions and overall objectives of the central government, however, remained unclear. This combination of factors, modified political reforms, enhanced international engagement, pent-up desire for economic development and civil society action, and the absence of a clear political strategy resulted in a frenzied atmosphere of high risk. It really felt like sort of a Wild West scenario. The persistent threat of political uncertainty and inconsistent financial regulation inspired opportunism amongst local and transnational actors. So it was against this background that the Yangon Heritage Movement was launched. It will not be a spoiler to say that these new developments all came to a screeching halt February 2021, when General Min Aung Hlaing led a coup d'etat whose violence continues to be inflicted upon the people of Myanmar. So it was founded as a port city, it remains a port city, it's the primate city, and as one of Southeast Asia's premier port cities, it has always been a very cosmopolitan space. This is Yangon. Because the country had been relatively isolated for more than half a century through neglect and by default, much of the historical architecture of the 19th and 20th centuries remained intact. I want to be clear that as I frame this, these buildings are not merely objects in and of themselves, but are expressive and co-productive of Burmese history and identity. The buildings and urban plan are more than symbols. They occupy and hold space for various forms of social, political, religious, and economic exchange. So whether it is a Chinese temple, a mosque, a church, a courthouse, or bottom left is a cinema, the cinema being a symbol of Burmese modernity. There was a thriving Burmese film industry at one point, but these all both represent and facilitate certain kinds of social and political practices. Life of the city happened on the streets, quite literally on its sidewalks. There's very little public open space in downtown Yangon, which is reflective of the government's position on public goods and social provisioning. The deep sidewalks historically served as gathering spaces of socializing and exchange. Economic liberalization quite literally cut into public life, as you can see in the bottom left two images. Sidewalks were diminished in deference to the explosion of cars that flooded the streets once prohibitive import tariffs were removed. So you already had a minimum of public open space, and those were sacrificed for cars, and sidewalks became strictly for circulation as opposed to social exchange. By 2011, Yangon had suffered more than half a century of decay, in large part due to government neglect and failed economic policies, which were further exacerbated by the relocation of the capital to Naypyidaw. The new capital was the indisputable showpiece of central government and the focus of its urban aspirations. Yangon was left to slowly deteriorate into the background of history. Buildings that had once housed ministry headquarters, national banks, and parliament were left nearly derelict, and physical infrastructure suffered from a lack of maintenance and system upgrades. Yangon, the government seemed to indicate, was no longer relevant nor worthy of investment. In addition, a convoluted history of property laws and a culture of fear cultivated by state tactics of oppression quashed collective identification with secular urban heritage. All of this could be read in the built environment, from the condition of the buildings and the negligibly functioning infrastructure to how people treated space, both individual and collective. Under the military regime, there was little opportunity for civic identity. So what I'm saying is you can actually read this in the built fabric of the city. So the facade of a building, facade means face, the face is a singular thing on a building, but these were very fragmented because there was a lack of a sense of communal identity and communal space, urban civic space. So you get this fragmented reading of the face of a building. In the center image, it's perhaps a little bit difficult to read with the visual noise, but many of the balconies are caged. And that really spoke to this level of distrust that had been actually cultivated over decades. And quite a few Burmese said to me individually on their own that, we don't trust one another. So there isn't that sense of communal identity. And then in terms of infrastructure, you can see examples of sort of the decayed state of things in the right-hand images. Corruption and neoliberalization, coupled with a lack of economic infrastructure to support the influx of actual and speculative investment, resulted in an inconsistently regulated environment of speculative development, rampant demolitions, and inflated property values. At one point during this second decade in the 21st century, office space was more expensive in downtown Yangon than in New York City, and UNICEF admitted to paying $87,000 a month for office space. All of this in a place that lacked functioning urban infrastructure, and there's inconsistencies with electricity and telecommunications, clean water, and legal protections. So this is your neoliberalization run wild. The Yangon Heritage Movement was officially launched in 2012 with the founding of the Yangon Heritage Trust. This announcement was delivered by its chairman and founder, Dr. Thant Myint-U, in the top center image. What began as an architectural conservation concern quickly evolved into a larger urban planning and civil society project. Myint-U understood that the conservation of individual buildings in the midst of anticipated rapid urbanization would largely be irrelevant and ineffectual. He centered heritage conservation in modernizing discourses and a vision for Asia's most livable city, a refrain that he and the trust circulated often. With a keen understanding of Myanmar's inferior development status, he anchored its urban future on the single most distinguishing characteristic of Yangon, the integrity of its historic built environment and all that held and fostered. This was in distinct contrast to most other Southeast Asian capitals that had privileged unregulated neoliberal development and sacrificed their historic built environments, such as Yangon and Singapore, among others. In the end, these urban environments ended up looking very much like one another. So Myint-U promoted the idea that Yangon had an opportunity to distinguish itself and retain its distinct identity, as well as benefit economically and socially. So what he and the trust did in its first few years, a list of a few things. So conceptually, he anchored Burmese modernity in Yangon, pointing to its history of global connectivity and cosmopolitanism, so linking it to the larger world. In comparing the exceptional integrity of Yangon's urban heritage in relation to other Southeast Asian cities, he elevated its status and relevance to an extra-national concern, which is important because he sort of lifted it out of the particular challenges of the political system within the country, within Myanmar, and made it relevant to a much larger context. He linked Yangon heritage conservation with 21st century urban development planning strategies and modern futures. Practically, he influenced discourse and perceptions of Yangon and Burmese heritage through local and international media outlets, building diverse audiences. So he's working at multiple scales, and he knew he needed to do that. At the local level, this generated heritage and urban development debates. He worked to integrate conservation into municipal planning policy and heritage legislation, and anchored his vision in physical projects to demonstrate the viability of ideas that otherwise seemed entirely abstract to a resident population whose primary experience of the built environment was of decay and neglect, and whose view of modernity was largely defined by a developmental modernism. And he cultivated collaborators and supporters to amplify the work. So through conferences, capacity building activities, advocacy activities, urban research projects, and more. And he exercised very careful and strategic selection of symbolic projects that implicitly broadcast particular civic ideals. And I'll get into that in a moment. In terms of scale, he developed a broad base of constituencies and understood the need to engage a high-level audience to demonstrate leadership buy-in and influence political support at multiple levels. So you worked with the president and his council, the International Diplomatic Corps, international NGOs, Yangon Burmese business leaders, the municipal government, and then at the local level, you worked with local residents because ultimately the work had to be relevant to them, and it would only be sustainable if it was relevant to them. And they were the primary beneficiaries. So they were involved in project participation. There was trade skills, learning, regular meetings with residents to identify what constituted heritage to them and where was it located within their neighborhoods. There were exhibitions featuring local efforts and history. Local residents served as tour guides. And then in identifying heritage in the built environment, local Burmese buildings and spaces were selected as opposed to, it's vernacular as opposed to monumental. I mean, there were monumental too, but there was an intention to identify what was representative of the everyday. So here are two examples of his strategic selection of initial projects. The Secretariat on the left, where the handover happened for Burmese independence, was the seat of government and the symbolic site of independence from the British. It is where Myint-U met with President Barack Obama, the first sitting US president, to visit Myanmar. And in their photographed walk through the grounds, this was not a mere stroll, but was a form of marking the space as emblematic of democracy. And on the right, Mahabandula Park, the main public green space in downtown Yangon. These urban spaces are potent for the ideals they embody and enable. Civic practices do not just happen sui generis. They're cultivated and require spaces for gathering and structures to house the various apparatuses that enact, adjudicate, and advance the rights, needs, and public goods of society. Myint-U and the Trust weren't just advocating for the preservation of historic buildings as exemplars of architectural style or as physical markers of past historic events as a form of collecting and curating the past. Here, heritage was enrolled in doing present work and in building a foundation for the future. What I am arguing here is how heritage conservation was leveraged in the formation of new publics and the cultivation of civic practices. Now, Mike Douglas writes about the importance of civic space as essential to cultivating civic behaviors. Civic spaces, he says, are defined as those spaces in which people of different origins and walks of life can come together without overt control by the government or by commercial or other private interests, or the de facto dominance of one group over another. Providing and giving sustenance to civic spaces is a basic requirement for genuine participation in governance. Civic practices, though, had to be modeled because after decades of severe restrictions on civic gathering and civic rights, actually, these had to be modeled. So the Trust did this through discursive and embodied practices in print journalism, interviews, lectures, and conferences, in urban and architectural space, through walking tours, events, and public recognition ceremonies, and through a blue plaque program in part modeled on the English heritage system. So you see people cutting ribbon for the placing of a new blue plaque in downtown Yangon and a building. and then articles or announcements for different kinds of events or discussing aspects of heritage and the built environment. So although the project departure point was architectural conservation, the built environment and conservation were the medium and method through which civic space was created, civic practices fostered, economic development was channeled, and the characteristics of Asia's most livable city were reified. In mobilizing discourses of heritage and modernity, and in reifying civic space, Myint-U and the Yangon Heritage Movement were forming new publics and cultivating civic practices. So Myint-U once said to me, "I don't care if people disagree with some of my positions on heritage conservation. I care that they are publicly debating the issues." So here we have an example of 491 to 501 Merchant Road. This was a residence in downtown Yangon. The project was a conservation project. It was funded and led by the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, part of the Prince's Trust out of England. It's a local residence. It represented the everyday. Resident participation was central to this conservation project. The residents were not collected, but invited to participate as a collective to offer their insights and desires and concerns and needs for what the building is, how they used it, what they wanted of it. And it was the first time that they had gathered as a collective to speak as a community within this singular building. So this was new and unfamiliar practice. In addition, the project was also designed as an opportunity for skills training in physical conservation. Towards the end of the decade, numerous direct and indirect outcomes of the Trust's efforts were visible. The city planning department began to integrate the vision of livability, heritage, conservation, and sustainable development. They initiated processes for demolition review, building permits, and guidelines for heritage protection. Other agencies developed zoning guidelines with considerations for the historic built environment. The Association of Myanmar Architects and Engineers developed building codes that accounted for historic structures. And all of these really furthered the goals and principles of what Lefebvre refers to as right to the city. So what I aimed to demonstrate today in this very synthetic presentation is how conservation and heritage were mobilized in the cultivation of civic practices and new publics. While the Yangon Heritage Movement may be shaped by a set of particular geopolitical conditions and the key figure of Thant Myint-U, the relevance of this case is applicable to how we, heritage conservation professionals and scholars, conceptualize the complex arrangement of tending to heritage and everyday social livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kesha. I am bursting to the seams with questions because your material is so amazingly rich. And I know we've had some conversations about different facets of these time and again, but every time I'm just struck by there's so many moving parts, but it's something that has been mobilized to make sense, even in something that seems more chaotic and a moment in time, particularly. I will also take this opportunity to just say that even though we'll be moving in a more conversational space now, the audience are very welcome to also post their own questions as we're talking, and we'll entertain questions along the go. So this is now a question answer session with everybody involved. You can put your questions in the chat. If you want them to be anonymous, you can just direct message me and I'll read them out. You can also use the raise hand function on Zoom and we'll recognize you and then we'll take that along. But just to kick off the conversation, as everyone's thinking, I think what I was particularly struck by is, I mean, it's a city, what the story that you're telling is not just historically rich, because you're also moving us through how this landscape hasn't been changing and navigated through, and the people that are involved. It's also a story of the city, of its people, of particular persons who've been influential and have been, let's say, have themselves been historical landmark symbols of different different changes here. And therefore, it's not a singular story. It's not, and I guess like I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about how do you think with these different changes that have been happening in this landscape. You've also talked about, of course, the most prominent figure of Dr. Myint-U, as especially in the latter part of the story, as being someone who's mobilized these heritage processes and instrumentalized them to create a certain kind of not just civic, but also spatial identity for the city of Yangon. Do you think he is someone who's the device or the conduit through which these changes are happening? Is he a part of the story? Is the story through him? Is the story about him? And maybe also as an extension, what are the other moving parts that you see in this story? What did you feel were things that were emerging or coming up to the surface as prominent categories as a part of these changes?
Right. Well, so loaded question as ever. He's definitely a key figure. So what was particular about Yangon at this moment in time when I was observing this nascent heritage movement, heritage conservation movement, was that, you know, because of the state of relative isolation that the country had been under for more than half a century, those who are responsible for conservation and heritage protections in the country were really not part of a larger community of the larger field of heritage conservation practitioners and scholars. And so when they came out, when there was this sort of opening up, what I was struck by was that through this figure of Myint-U and the foundation of the Yangon Heritage Trust, this organization took the lead to begin to define what their heritage was and how they wanted to conserve it. And for those who may not be as familiar, over the past 25 years in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about a lot of discussion in terms of conservation theories. You know, should it be this way or that way? Is there such a thing as Asian heritage conservation? Is it different from the West? But here, this was being led internally, and it seemed particularly different from other things I saw around it, which were much more object focused. In terms of they were focused on an object. It was an object of the past, and you were preserving it as an example of the past. Here, someone was taking heritage and framing it as, this is our future, right? Our future pivots around this. And while he never explicitly says it, what he's doing is democracy work. He can't say that because of the political scenario, but that's what he's doing. And that was so striking to me. And so he's centering heritage and its conservation to do something much larger. And I still think that's relevant for the broader international discourse on conservation and heritage. And I see it, within this country, my own country, in terms of how we try to argue the value of heritage and why something should be concerned. And only now are we beginning to understand that these things have to be linked to social livelihood or economic livelihood, or the whole raft of these things together, or climate change. And this person centers it immediately. Now, then you ask me about the figure of Thant Myint-U. He is exceptional, and it is an exceptional moment in time. And he is the original cosmopolitan. I mean, he is the grandson of U Thant, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations. He's educated he's culturally fluent in his own country and culture because of his family and his where he's from, but then he is raised in the United States. He's schooled at Harvard, Johns Hopkins University, Cambridge University. He lectures in England, and he is, and he works at the United Nations too. He had his own sort of career there, and so understands diplomacy and has done a lot of peace work. So it has very sophisticated set of tools at his disposal, intellectual and diplomatic tools at his disposal to understand the complexity of systems and how it takes building a strategy that with a broad base to effect kinds of change. And he also has a political position that enables him to access a lot of these different constituencies. So that's not everyone. So he is very particular, but just because you have an exceptional figure that perhaps is not replicated in every other scenario in other countries, there are still, I think that there are still very valuable insights to be gleaned from this example in terms of how to center heritage, what kinds of work conservation can do, and that, and it's this governance work that I'm in particular really fascinated by, the sort of civil society building, the actual sort of formation of new publics. So that was a rambling answer, but.
Oh, that's incredibly useful, because then the sense that I also get is like, while this person's incredibly influential and important, they're also bringing worlds with them, which is becomes the device through which like things happen, or they're rather a magnet that are doing the work of bringing things together. So in some ways, they're also important, but what they represent and are able to accomplish is also incredibly important. And I guess like we see those, if not in this space, we do see that in different, let's say, countries where I guess there's a, like you mentioned, there's a moment in time. I mean, in the case of, I would say, the Indian political landscape, which is the one that I'm most conversant with, the rise of a certain, let's say, political movement or is on the heels of certain individuals and the worlds and the charisma, the personal, professional, and I would say the different qualities that they bring to the table, and the power of mobilization at the end of the day. So it makes total sense. That also leads me to believe, like, when you're talking about this person, and I mean, not just Dr. Myint-U, but also these different institutions that are also like playing actors and what's happening on the Yangon landscape regarding like with the Yangon Heritage Movement and so on and so forth. Just as someone who's interested in heritage theory and the applicability of how heritage practitioners and different people thinking about heritage end up doing their work, would you say in this case, is heritage a site of analysis, or is heritage a device of being able to deploy whatever is required? Because you talk about the cultivation of a civic identity. Clearly, heritage is a big actor here. Or is heritage being used, or is heritage the site within which all of this is being done?
Interesting. I mean, I think it's both. It's being used, but it's co-productive too. So through these, through the identification of, I mean, heritage is really created in a sense because for background, none of these sites were identified as heritage by the state, okay, by the government. The state, when this Yangon Heritage Movement is launched, it is antithetical to how heritage is defined within the country, within Burma, because up to that point, it was all antiquities, and it was, or it was religious, so it was connected to Buddhism, or it was royal, so a palace, but nothing vernacular, nothing secular, and really not urban heritage. So this heritage is conjured, it's created by through the act of identifying it. So it's the site, but it's also co-productive of this kind of civic formation. So it's used, but by saying, look, it was already there, but through the act of identifying these sites, through the acts of actually using these sites and conserving them, it is creating a civic behavior. So it's both things going on. That may not be a very satisfying answer, but
that's the beauty of the work, right? Like it's not one or the other as one positions them.
right.
Like if heritage is a site of action versus being the device of action, right? It is both, as you say, and that's very useful. We also have a question from the audience. So do you know what the state of the Heritage Trust program in Yangon is today? Does the current government respect and support the program?
Right, and that's a good question. It's pretty quiet in terms of the trust. You know, I have gone onto I go into their website regularly, and portions of it are, I wouldn't say shut down, but they're not active anymore. You can't access certain bits of information. I know that, or my last knowledge of Dr. Myint-U was that he was in England. My sense is that activities are pretty curtailed. I don't know how active they are. I would doubt that they're particularly active right now. I think that most things are pretty curtailed there right now. So, you know, even while I was observing it going on in the 2010s, it seemed like an experiment. And, you know, now when you look back, because there's this bookend to it, and we hope it has an end. I mean, that this bookend comes down and another chapter starts. But being bookended by these two sort of political regimes does make it seem even more like an experiment. But I still think there's a lot to be gained. And I think that there's a lot of public memory of what that experience was. That has not gone away. And that's why you continue to see protest.
Thank you so much for the question and the answer. I think I was also thinking about when you were talking how certain strategically preserved buildings, historical buildings, have become or are symbols of social and political practices. And you'd mentioned there's a cinema hall, there are temples, there are also like the parliament building and so on and so forth. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit as to how is it that these buildings are differently symbolic or considered important by their users and those who preserve them and so on and so forth. And I ask this also specifically because sometimes heritage conservation discourse is blamed with not like flattening out heritage relevance or heritage value just in terms of chronological terms or just in terms of aesthetic material fabric terms. So I was wondering if, while doing your research, if you came across or are able to say more about how this symbolism is deconstructed or experienced differently, and if there are certain tiers to it as well, that the state looking at it versus heritage practitioners versus community engagement, and also maybe if you saw differences over a period of time.
Good question. So I mentioned that one of the first projects was the Secretariat building. And I think specifically, I think because of its monumentality, because of its central location, I mean, it was the heart. So it was the heart physically, sort of spatially in the city, but it was also the heart in terms of governance and history, and it represented and embodied these certain kind of democratic notions, I think, for Myint-U, although again, that was not explicit. So that was the first project that he identified. That actually was really stalled. I mean, they couldn't really go very far with that because I think there were certain blocks put in front of that because it's so politically hot, because it was such a symbolic project. It was hard to get the kinds of permissions to deal with that. But what it did generate was a lot of conversation. And so it started to get people thinking about, oh, well, you know, because if someone reacts to it, then you have to wonder, why are they reacting to it, right? So what is the position that someone's taking, whether it's explicit or implicit? And then at some point, it seemed like a contract was given to someone, it seemed through cronyism, to actually deal with the conservation of the building, but it was all going to be privatized. And then there were discussions about that. While there were certain buildings identified because of what they symbolized, they weren't always, those projects weren't always realized, or certainly not in the sequence or ordering in which they had been first addressed. The moving to the residence project of the everyday was really savvy, because it brought it down to an everyday lived sort of level and made it really directly relevant in terms of quality of life for just the everyday person. It wasn't there to just be a symbol, right? Like a abstract symbol of who we are and what we might be. It's just like, I need to live and I need water. You know, I need a clean building. But in fact, I think it was a much more powerful move, because in doing that and in holding those regular residence meetings and in cultivating a sense of community, it actively engaged people in those kinds of civic practices that I've been talking about and that are central to democracy work. And then you can take that out and, you know, radiate that out, scale it up, right? Through things then that are just not about where you live in your building, but are that on your street, you know, or your sidewalk. Is your sidewalk being cut apart, you know? But certainly different actors sort of viewed these projects or works through different lenses. So the INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, those third sector organizations who were doing the conservation work at times, very often, you know, they have their own agendas. And it was interesting to read sort of colonial legacies too, you know. Myint-U is turning to the blue plaques. I mean, the blue plaques are English. Myint-U has a long history with Cambridge and England, and the country has a relationship there. You could sort of read those legacies there. The US was not very involved. It was always a little bit, it was interesting to me to observe what seemed to be certain kind of political legacies or contemporary kind of agendas. Australia was all over the place. But Australia has its own agenda of identifying itself as part of the Asia Pacific and being a presence and force in the Asia Pacific. So the US was involved, but we just weren't as present in many of those actions. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
I did. In fact, it kind of generated more, where I think and I think the last part is very complementary to our next audience question. But before that, as you were talking, I was thinking through, like, generally when one's thinking about, even let's say if one wants to step into the shoes of an authority that wants to dictate how space is used or not used, one thinks of these binaries of, okay, when you monumentalize something and you declare it as a heritage building and a historical building, you kind of mediate access to it, and which is more often on the side of that the number of people and the variety of people who could use it in the everyday can't do it anymore. You create ticketing booths, you put a plaque out that's saying this is super old, you can't touch this, you can't use this,
right.
you can't sit here. And then on the other hand is this story of there's neglect, the state doesn't care because people come and they go and they do whatever they want. But I think what you're also pointing towards, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a story in the middle where there is this tension, or rather this, I don't know if the correct word is commitment, but definitely a strategy to have community engagement as consumer engagement, but then also see what's the middle ground in being able to convert those spaces or allow for community residents in ways they want to use it, but also retaining its heritage character. So it's not really like one or the other, but it's about like spatially redefining, a strategic redefining. And I'm always fascinated by how does one go about doing it effectively, because nobody likes being told how to use a space. Either they have their own historic ways, generational ways of, you know, we used to hang out here all the time, and therefore this is nostalgic or historical value for us. And then people came and picketed it and put fences around, and now we don't use it anymore. But how does it then get to a place where you still want people to use it, but not necessarily in the ways that they're used to using it? So
right. Interesting. I mean, I think a part of the context here was that the city was just packed with sort of, there was this influx of interest, international interest in the city, and also from the diasporic community. So because of this opening up and these political reforms and a relaxing of constraints, political restraints on civil liberties, there was a perception of enormous potential and desire. And from people who want to profit, you know, economically, and from people who really want to return and contribute back to their country and society in terms of its heart and its people and their success. And so you have a certain amount of built environment. You have this historic built fabric that is unlike other Southeast Asian cities. So it does get framed through conferences. I mean, I would hear it a lot as an asset, right? And I always find that sort of interesting when you take heritage and you frame it as an asset, because now you've just commodified it, right? But there was also a real need, though, for opportunities for economic development. So I think where part of the brilliance came in was, okay, we have these buildings, but we also have needs for, you know, office space or markets or residences or what have you. And so let's just overlap those. It wasn't so much a case of we have a building, but we can't figure out what to do with it. Actually, it's not true, because the Secretariat, that large parliamentary building, was so enormous. I mean, it's a whole block. So that actually was a problem. Like, what do we do with it? And there were different conservation studies done as to what are the possible reuses for this. So it would have to be mixed use, right? Like, okay, you could have a library here. You could have, you know, you could have offices here. You could have a gallery here. You could have this, that. I don't know what ultimately ended up. I know that certain portions of it have been conserved and adaptively used. But I seriously doubt they've gotten through the whole building, because that's a lot of square footage in terms of plan. And then, you know, there are the questions of financing and maintenance, like who oversees that whole thing? Because the moment you can't easily break it up in terms of ownership. You could, but then you're going to have the same maintenance problems that you perceive in the rest of the city. So it's very multi-pronged, and it's not just, I think the key thing too is that this wasn't done just for tourism. This wasn't done just for, because when it's done just for tourism, that's always problematic, right? And it wasn't done just as an object of the past. That was my comment about sort of curating and collecting these buildings, but these are all used. So the trick is really, how are they integrated and used in daily life? But it was the places that embodied sort of civic identity, or that created civic spaces, that were the first moves, right? That really get people involved. And then, you know, but the first meeting, though, the launch and announcement of the trust was held in the Strand Hotel, which is this historic hotel in downtown Yangon that had been conserved actually in the end of the 20th century. And it was a luxury hotel. And so it demonstrated, oh, you can do this and make money, right? So they hold it there first to demonstrate in particular for Burmese government and business leaders, the viability of this idea.
Great. Thank you so much. We're almost at time, but I think I want to get two questions in, one from the audience, and then I wanted us to end on a pedagogical note to basically, because again, it's very rare we have an active applied person also doing theory and other disciplinary work. So if our audience can stay on for 10 minutes, I think these two questions would be great. So our audience question is, you mentioned how the factors such as global connectivity and cosmopolitanism are underscored by the program in bringing it to the global audience. Could you elaborate a little bit on the devices, such as specific sites and narratives through which this is accomplished?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Sure. You mentioned how the factors such as global connectivity and cosmopolitanism are underscored by the program. I'm supposing it's the Yangon Heritage Program,
right,
in bringing it to the global audience. Could you elaborate a little bit on the devices, that is, such as specific sites or narratives through which this is accomplished?
Oh, sure. Okay. So, so there were a few things at the earliest stages when Myint-U was, so he writes about it. And he writes about it in venues such as the Financial Times. The Financial Times is this pink newspaper that, you know, if you fly business class internationally, that's the paper you get, right? So he's targeting a particular audience, a worldly audience, a cosmopolitan audience, a mobile audience. And when he talks about Yangon, he talks about its cosmopolitan history. So he demonstrates this kind of global connectivity and relevance. And then he's also on a lecture circuit for the first few years. I mean, he's often invited to places, and he puts forward these images of, you know, the different people and the built environment and the sort of historical developments that happen through this city. He talks about, you know, Amelia Earhart. He talks about George Orwell. He talks about the presence of Gandhi. He talks about political relationships and Yangon's connectivity, about sort of airline travel coming through and, you know, advertising Yangon. But so he does it through discourse. He shows a lot of images. There's a power of images in all of this. And then, so he's constantly using this cosmopolitan language. And then in the tours that they develop through the city. So this is an embodied kind of phenomenological, we're going to move through space. We're going to see all these things and actually hit these different sites through a walking tour. So it's in discourse, it's in the, they didn't work on conserving religious sites, for example, as one aspect of that kind of diversity and pluralistic environment. Because those are often managed by trusts who generally take care of their own sites, but they're featured in how Yangon's heritage is talked about. And then, yeah, it's kind of about, and in the ways that people from Yangon participated in a larger global discourse. So whether it is at the United Nations, you know, or in other kinds of international relations. So that's one response to the question.
Thank you. And I think I just wanted to quickly maybe ask our last question on just And how is it that you went about your research as someone who is, has been heavily involved in applied conservation work? You worked with multiple bodies that do that. Is there and I know this is a part of your doctoral research. So as you were going about and pursuing different threads of these research, did you feel there was a shift of lens that you had to do between like being a conservator who's been in this space for so long to now a researcher who has to rely on other methods? I get the sense that you have used archival and ethnographic methods as a part of this. How complementary are these in your experience, or how much of a switch do you have to do between like, okay, I have to put away my conservator cap and then take on my other caps for this project? Did you feel that way at all?
That is such a good question. And I really struggled with that as a practitioner. And not only, so I struggled with it on a couple of levels. One, as a practitioner, where, as a practitioner, you are there to solve a problem. What is, identify the problem, identify the causes of the problem, and develop a solution to solve it. As a researcher, you're there to understand something. So the way I've always framed it is, on the one hand, there's problem solving, and on the other hand, there's problematizing. And as a researcher, you're there to problematize. The other hurdle that I experienced is that prior to doing my research in Yangon, I worked for the Getty Conservation Institute, which is a fairly august institution. And that when I went into sites or into environments working for the Getty Conservation Institution, it was like there's this big monolithic thing behind me and these doors opened, But as a single researcher, okay, I came from a university and I had university representation, but I was like this little mouse. It's like doors didn't open. I'm like, hi, could you tell me something? So that was very disorienting and quite challenging. And I remember I was walking down the sidewalk in downtown Yangon. It's like, okay, so what am I going to do about this? Because people aren't going to just let me in, and they're not going to just tell me something. And then I thought, okay, so when I worked for the institution, big doors open. But when you work for an institution, it is a big monolithic thing, and you can't be as nimble, right? Because there's a lot of protocol. But as an independent researcher, I'm like, okay, you're the little mouse, you can fit through really tiny spaces. So that's your advantage. But I, in terms of methods, I did some participant observation, and also I was able to develop a relationship with the Yangon Heritage Trust and make myself useful. So I did some research for them. I wrote a kind of position paper for them that had to do with what was going on in downtown Yangon, where there were these rampant demolitions through a device known as sort of the dangerous building. I don't know what to call it. It's not an act, but it was a device, right? A mechanism that you could use for demolishing buildings. You just call it dangerous, get the city to put a red sign on it, and then boom, it's gone. But so how was this being done? What was the structure and system in place that allowed for this to happen at such high speeds? And therefore, in understanding all of that and the infrastructure, then how could you counter it? So I did things with them, which also gave me some entree then to officials at the municipality, the YCDC. I interviewed people. I was involved in part in helping to develop, a 2-day workshop of things. So I was really sort of embedded in there. But it was I will admit, it was very difficult for me to always navigate that line. Like, I'm not here to be their staff, but I will be useful, but I'm here to observe and to understand what I can from my time here. but it was tricky. I mean, it was a first for me.
Yeah, I mean, and that's great perspective and great advice also, honestly. So thank you for
Sure.
that.
It's hard. I mean, I'm sure others who are much more experienced at it, who've done it time and time and time again, have more direct guidance. But I find it tricky. But it was a huge learning experience. You know, I mean, kind of opened up my own perspective and view onto how to think about conservation and what it's doing. And how to different ways of engaging, different methods for engaging with the site, whether it is institution, place, people, organization, right?
Right. No, thank you so much. And I wish this conversation could go on for the next 4 hours, but unfortunately we're at time. I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who attended today and was a part of this conversation. First and foremost, thanks to Kesha for really agreeing to be a part of this. There was so much I learned personally. So for very selfish reasons, I benefited a lot from this conversation today. Thank you. And I hope to be able to talk about many other aspects of your work and learn further in the future. And I'm sure like others who would also want to continue this conversation with Kesha can reach her through her email. And secondly, I want to thank Stanford Global Studies, because of whom this research workshop was possible today. And unfortunately, this is our last Zoom event. Our next and last workshop for this academic session is going to be on the 12th of May with Professor Lynn Mescal, also from the University of Pennsylvania. But that will be an in-person session. So if you can fly to Stanford, very, very welcome and very encouraged to do that. I've been told there are snacks and that is something I can offer. But thank you once again and hope you have a lovely rest of your day and a lovely weekend.
Thank you so much, Shumi. Bye.